welcome back to the Classics Capsule. My name is Sean McKiernan, and today we are looking at a very specific genre of film. Since movies began, filmmakers have been fascinated with monsters and all kinds of hideous creatures, and they all generally had one aim, and that was to destroy all mankind and everything all about them. Then in 1933, RKO Pictures moved the goalposts massively when they introduced a character and a film. The film was made by a gentleman named Merian C. Cooper, and he wanted a film about a giant primate that would go around basically destroying everything all around it. That is how this film first started its development and its life. He wanted his character to be half gorilla and half human, and the original designs for the creature are very much along those lines, where the animal has very definite gorilla appearances but is also very much half man as well. During the scripting process, the story changed massively, and the film became an absolute classic in cinema even today, and that film is King Kong. The story starts off on Skull Island, where Kong lives along with a number of similarly gigantic creatures. He's not alone in any stretch of the imagination, but it is very much a land where time forgot, in that you have dinosaurs and all kinds of things living there, and Kong is very much in charge of the thing. He's captured and is taken to New York, and he is very much portrayed as an anti-hero right the way through the film. It's not a sort of classic monster film as such. It very much shows this creature as a character in his own right, and it's a very interesting move on the part of the filmmakers, in that Kong is not just a monster. He has his own motivations. He basically wants to protect beauty, and the climax of the thing finishes with him climbing the Empire State Building, very much in his mind to protect the actress who he has fallen in love with, who was portrayed by Fay Wray. And when he gets to the top of the Empire State Building, of course, the gorilla is attacked by aeroplanes and he falls to his death. And a reporter who has tracked Kong throughout issues the classic line at the end: "It wasn't the aeroplanes that killed him, it was beauty that killed the beast." The film is, by today's standard, it is clunky. It has to be said, it is incredibly clunky, but you have to go back to 1933 and you have to appreciate the massive success in the stop motion animation that was carried out to do this. It was not a man in a suit, which is the other major change. It was all done by stop motion animation, whereby you have a model, and each frame the model is moved very slightly, so that when the film is all run together, it looks like the creature is moving. It was a very expensive art and a very time-consuming art, and for the time it is an absolute triumph. And RKO Pictures realised it was a triumph to the point where later on in the same year they introduced another film in the King Kong series, The Son of Kong. Nowhere near as good, in my opinion. There's only one King Kong, there's only one classic King Kong picture, and really it should, for me, be left well alone and never ever gone back to. You cannot improve on the perfection that first King Kong film is. King Kong hasn't been reintroduced numerous times. There was a 1962 film, King Kong versus Godzilla, which we'll look at very shortly. Uh, the first modern remake, if you like, was in 1976. The least said about it, the better, really. It is very much a remake in the absolute classic sense of the word. It's virtually scene for scene identical to the original, but it's very glossy. It has all the 70s production values, and it loses an awful lot of the charm that the original King Kong film had for me. There was a sequel to that film in 1986 when we're then introduced to Lady Kong in King Kong Lives. Wasn't a major success, to the point where King Kong was basically ignored until 2005 when Peter Jackson came along on the scene, and he remade King Kong, set his film in 1933, and very much went right back to basics. Of the remakes and the modern takes on Kong, it's probably the best one of them all. The film starts again on Skull Island. King Kong is very much a gigantic silverback gorilla. There's absolutely no human features about him whatsoever. He is a gorilla. He moves as a gorilla and he acts as a gorilla. He's portrayed as being quite an elderly creature. He has an awful lot of battle scars. And as in 1933, which was a triumph for the stop motion animation technique, Peter Jackson, for his version of it, went along the lines, not so much of a man in a suit, but he went for motion capture, where he had an actor in a green suit on a green screen doing all of the movements, which then enabled him to superimpose a gorilla image over the actor. It does work. It really does work, and it is a lot more believable than the 1933 version of the story. But you know, as I said, you can't really bet it on the perfection of that film. Yes, the 33 film is clunky. Yes, it looks, by today's standard, incredibly daft and incredibly cheap. But it is absolutely brilliant for its time, and you really cannot better it. Now, during the course of that, I mentioned another monster, and no talk about monster films can be complete without the king of the monsters, as he's now dubbed. To give him his original name, Gojira was very much a political allegory when he was first introduced. His background in the creation of the creature is actually from a very, very sad period when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, and a subsequent test of a nuclear explosion saw a Japanese fishing boat go into the test zone, and the crew ended up all contaminated with radiation. Watching all of these films and all of these stories was a filmmaker very, very well known in Japan at the time, not so much around the rest of the world, named Ishiro Honda. And he came up with the idea of a monster who was very much an image of the horrors that the people of Japan had suffered when the atom bomb went off. And as such, Godzilla, or Gojira, was created. Now, originally he was depicted as a very, very destructive prehistoric sea monster. And he is awakened by nuclear radiation, which also gives him an awful lot of the power that he has. His main weapon is to breathe a radioactive beam out of his mouth, which in 1954, when the film was introduced, it wasn't really achieved in the greatest of manners. It basically just looks like a load of smoke coming out of his mouth. It looks like he's had a very, very heavy cigarette, basically. But as the series expanded and progressed, Godzilla was very much developed away from being just a destructive monster. And again, like King Kong, he was in some films portrayed very much as an anti-hero and also as a defender of humanity. There's quite a few films where the Earth is invaded by aliens and Godzilla is the one that saves the planet from the aliens. When the film was first made, Honda's first choice on how to realise Godzilla was to use stop motion animation in the same way that King Kong had been realised in the 1930s. And when he investigated that technology, it was very, very primitive in Japan at the time, and there weren't that many technicians who were capable of doing it to the required standard. So Toho Films, who were behind the production, went to America to try to persuade American technicians to go across to Japan to make the film. And the cost of doing that would have drove the film way over budget and probably put Toho into bankruptcy, so they abandoned the whole idea. So Godzilla was realised very much along the lines of the traditional way of a man in a rubber suit. And to try to get a bit of grace into the movement of the creature, they hired an actor who was also a black belt in judo, who came up with 90% of the movements for the creature and how the creature would move. Gojira, when it was released, was a major, major success in Japan. And at that point, he was known as Gojira. He wasn't known as anything else. The Western world had not been introduced to the film. When it was released in America, it was redubbed as Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And that tagline has since been used to describe Godzilla ever since. Now, the film was not without its problems. The actor who was in the Godzilla suit, the suit was made of rubber with a lot of steel reinforcement, particularly in its legs. And the actor, when he was walking around in the suit, would very often complain that his legs were being cut because the steel was coming loose out of the rubber and then was digging into his shins. As the series progressed, more monsters were introduced, some as allies to Godzilla, some as enemies, and probably the best known of these is Radon. A Radon is very much a gigantic pterodon, and the name is a shortened version of pterodon. The character's name was changed to Rodan in the English-speaking films because it was worried that English audiences would confuse radon with the chemical element of radon, and that wasn't the intention at all. So, to take that confusion out the way, Radon became Rodan, although in one of the Godzilla films that Rodan appears in, the Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, he is referred to as Radon throughout that film. The character, like the same way as Godzilla was conceived as a political allegory about the atomic weaponry that had been used during the Second World War, Radon was conceived as a political allegory about the potential threat of a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union Empire. He was created partly through a man in a suit, which was given the term suitmation by Ishiro Honda, and also partly by puppetry. The suit caused major problems again, mainly because of its weight. It weighed 150 pounds and was made of solid rubber. And the actor inside it at one point, during the filming of a sequence where Radon is flying over a water and the wires supporting the costume snapped, and the suit with the actor in it dropped into the water tank and promptly sank, and the actor very nearly didn't get out in time. This, of course, is the 1950s, where health and safety didn't really exist, so that sort of accident was actually quite commonplace in those days. Rodan was introduced in 1956 in his own film. He was brought in to the Godzilla series in 1993 in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Again, with puppets, but also just with wire marionettes as well, hand puppetry. There was no actor in a suit this time because by the 1990s, of course, health and safety would preclude dressing a man in a rubber suit and then suspending him several feet in the air against a blue or green screen. In 2014, Legendary Pictures acquired the rights to Rodan, Godzilla, and the rest of the monster menagerie to use in the Monsterverse, as they call it. And in the last few weeks, the new Godzilla film has just been released, and Rodan is in that film. And in the film, he is described as a tannic creature with skeletal structure of a pterodon and magma skin becoming plate armour, which is a hell of a change from being a gigantic dinosaur. Again, it's a development on the original take, and in the 1950s it would have been impossible to do a suit like that. Another one of the creatures from that time is Mothra, originally called Messiora, who is a heroic gigantic moth. Mothra is always accompanied by two twins, two fairies. It was originally going to be four, but the film company wanted real twins to do this role, and twins are very rare in Japan, and they had a hell of a job finding four twins. So to make their life easier, they cut the script down to just have two instead. So there's only two of these characters. Now, every good hero, like Godzilla, needs a classic enemy. And Godzilla's is a three-headed monster, very much along the lines of the Hydra, whose name is King Ghidorah. He's golden scaled with bat wings, very much along the lines of a dragon's body. He has two legs, he has two tails, three hands, and three heads. It's believed, although it's never really been confirmed, that again, this monster is again a political allegory. But whereas Godzilla represented the threat from America and Radon represented the threat from the USSR, it's rumoured that Ghidorah reflects the threat from China. The character appeared at roughly the same time as when China developed its own nuclear weaponry arsenal. And the rumours are that this particular monster is there to represent the threat from China having nuclear weapons, which has never been confirmed, but it's also never been denied by any of the filmmakers who were behind this. In his debut film, he was introduced as an ancient extraterrestrial who was responsible for destroying a civilization on the planet Venus 5,000 years ago. Now, this is a bit confusing because Ghidorah has actually got 3 or 4 different origin stories, but the original one was that he was of alien descent himself, and he comes to Earth and tries to destroy the Earth and is defeated by Godzilla, who is now, rather than a baddie, is now fighting for humanity, although not in the way that you would expect, because while he is defending humanity and the planet, Godzilla also sees nothing wrong in destroying everything around him at the same time. Later on, the character is used as a pawn of various alien races who are trying to take over the Earth. Now, Godzilla started off with one film. It did very much become a franchise. And to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Toho Productions, Toho had always wanted to make a King Kong film. And in the 1960s, when Toho was in its 30th year, it got its wish when the original stop-motion animation technician for King Kong from the 1930s developed a storyline where King Kong meets Frankenstein. And during the course of the film, King Kong would meet a gigantic version of the Frankenstein monster. It didn't go ahead for various reasons, the main one being the finance of the film would have been prohibitive. So, in pitching this idea around to various studios, it eventually landed with Toho. And they read the script and they were taken with the idea, but they couldn't really imagine King Kong being with Frankenstein's monster, who had already been seen as basically a gigantic human. However, as it was Toho's 30th anniversary and they very much wanted to reintroduce the Godzilla character, who hadn't been seen at that point for nearly a decade, what better way to celebrate but to bring Godzilla into a film with King Kong? So O'Brien's script was rewritten and King Kong met Godzilla. And unlike the original 1933 film, King Kong is played by an actor in a suit. Godzilla, as always, is played by a man in a suit. And if you've never seen this film, you should watch it, because it's entertaining in the same way that Plan 9 from Outer Space is entertaining. It is the absolute climax, and for me, one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life is Godzilla, this massive prehistoric dinosaur, launching itself into a perfect drop kick into King Kong and then beating him about the head with its tail. It is one of the funniest things you can ever see in your life, and it's tragic because it's not supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be very, very dramatic, but you just cannot help but watch and laugh at the sight of this thing, this huge dinosaur flying through the air with one leg outstretched and landing a perfect drop kicker on the chest of this massive gorilla. King Kong gets burnt by Godzilla's radioactive breath, and rather than do anything, he just does the classic King Kong thing of just look down, look up, and then start beating his chest. It is so laughably cheesy. It's brilliant. But
and he shoves a tree down his throat.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to forget the bit where there's a tree shoved down the throat as well, but that is just like it really is. If you've not seen that film, you've got to seek it out and watch it, because it used to be a staple of Christmas schedules very early in the morning, and flame. It is. It's hysterical. It's worth watching just for that one sequence at the end itself. Now, King Kong versus Godzilla is scheduled for a reissue next year. And as with all monster films now, the two monsters will no doubt be created using computer-generated imagery, which, while it's very, very believable, it does take an awful lot of the charm out of the originals. It might be because of my generation that I'm from, but I was brought up watching Doctor Who on a Saturday evening when you used to be genuinely terrified of men dressed very obviously in rubber suits. And these monsters from the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s are very much of that same design. They have a charm all of their own, and at this point an honourable mention has got to be made for another film made by Ishiro Honda named War of the Gargantuas. It is another film which, if you've never seen it, you have got to see it. It is an absolute classic, cheesy science fiction stroke horror film. It is a co-production with Toho and an American production house. And thanks to that co-production, they managed to get quite a well-known actor from America to be its major star, an actor named Ross Tamlin, who, before he made this film, had been in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers and also made a major name for himself in Peyton Place, and was also the leader of one of the gangs in West Side Story. In 1966, he went into the horror genre when he played a scientist in War of the Gargantuas. Now, although it's never overtly mentioned in the film, War of the Gargantuas is actually a sequel to Frankenstein Conquers the World, which came out in 1965. And in the film, there are two giant, hairy, humanoid monsters whose features very much resemble the original Frankenstein monster makeup. And the story is that they are created by two discarded cells, one of which lands in the sea and one of which lands in the mountains. And one of the monsters is a gigantic sea monster whose name is Gaira, which is derived from the Japanese word for sea, which is kai. And he is incredibly violent and incredibly savage. And the other cell which lands in the mountain develops into a brown monster whose name is Sanda, which is derived from the Japanese word for mountain. And he is friendly and docile. And the film basically follows the investigations into these creatures and the military engagements with them until and including the final confrontation, which takes place in Tokyo and basically flattens the entire city, which tends to happen an awful lot to a major part of Japan in every single one of these films. There are so many sequences that spring to mind with this. One is where Gaira attacks an airport, and this moment of supposed horror is completely destroyed with this unintentionally comic moment when he completely devours a woman but then spits her dress out. I did say it was cheesy. The film has a deliberately ambiguous ending. I think the original idea was to leave it open for a possible sequel, which depends on your viewpoint, either fortunately or fortunately never materialised. But it is left quite open to interpretation on whether these two monsters survive. They are both caught in a gigantic volcanic eruption. And rather than see what happens to them, the two creatures just disappear completely, and there's no explanation given as to whether they survive or whether they die. For me, War of the Gargantuas is very much a standalone film, and it would be a major mistake to go back to it, although in this day and age of the Monsterverse coming up now, it wouldn't surprise me if at some point there is another attempt made to do it. It would be a major mistake. It would be pretty much as big a mistake as making the original film was, really. But as I say, in the world of cinema, nothing surprises me, and it wouldn't surprise me if in 2 or 3 years' time we do get a remake of War of the Gargantuas with CGI. And if that is the case, it would no doubt be turned into a major gore fest, which just would not work at all. The film has a charm, the story has a charm. Peter Jackson got that charm spot on when he remade King Kong, and he manages to capture that charm in his film. It's debatable if the new Godzilla film will capture the charm of the original Godzilla films. Although going back to Godzilla, it is worthwhile noting that Godzilla was actually named an ambassador for a part of Japan. He is actually a cultural ambassador for a part of Japan where Toho films originated from. And when the honour was conferred on the creature, there was a man dressed in a Godzilla suit to receive it, which was quite an interesting thing, because the poor bloke in the rubber suit couldn't actually get hold of the scroll and certificate because the hands were too thick, he couldn't grasp anything. And the ironic thing was that, as many of the newspapers pointed out, that the province of Japan that Godzilla is now a cultural ambassador for was actually flattened 3 times in 3 different Godzilla films by Godzilla. And now Godzilla is a province for that same area. As I say, nothing in cinema surprises me anymore. It's been a great delight, this particular part of the Classics Capsule. I do like monster films. As I say, they have a charm all of their own. If you've not seen these films, you really have got to seek them out, especially King Kong versus Godzilla and War of the Gargantuas. If you've not seen them, there is a major gap in your education.
Footnote: Godzilla versus Megalon.
As the voice from the heavens has just pointed out, Godzilla has featured in numerous films. One of the greatest, if you could call it that, is Godzilla versus the Megalodon. Again, made very much along the lines of suitmation and puppetry. And it like all Godzilla films, it has an innate charm all of its own. For the time that it's made, it's brilliant. For the time it's made, the special effects are absolutely fantastic. Nowadays you'd look at it and think the special effects are absolutely risible, but you know, you're going back 50, 60 years looking at when these films were made. For the technology that they had and the techniques that they had, the films are absolutely brilliant, technically and artistically. And they are worth a place on anybody's film library. They really are. And you know, you really do have to go out and see them.
And I just add, it's a precursor to the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. because of the whole Voltron series and everything. So Jet Jaguar was introduced in Godzilla vs. Megalon.
Yep.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I had to say it.
Now, in the next Classics capsule, we will be taking a car ride with a difference. And that is all I'm going to say at this particular point in time. This is Sean McKeon and signing off until next time. Thank you very much.